Barely. It's like clipped.
We're on.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, the power wasn't on. Anyway, it is January 5th, 2020. Have 2020 vision. Everything is clear. Freaking World War III is trending.
I think last year this time we were talking about like South America.
Oh yeah, that's right, because we had that drone.
The drone strike.
The drone strike.
that dispersed the parade.
Yeah.
And all of was it Venezuela or Ecuador? I think it was Venezuela.
I think it was Venezuela, yeah.
Yeah, and all the military just like
they just ran.
They ran. They abandoned their leader.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about that this time last year. Huh, yeah. Crazy how that works out. But, you know, with this whole shit happening now, it's like there's a lot of talk about what is going to happen on the global stage, and I'm very skeptical if this goes into a full-on world war, in that that's a huge step. I don't think people really understand what that really means if it's an actual world war and not just a Middle Eastern conflict. Because, I mean, the conflict has already started in the sense...
The conflict's been ongoing.
Right. So it's not... The difference between a Middle Eastern conflict and a world war is on an exponential scale, in that when you have China and Russia coming out working with France, effectively taking the moral high ground in this, we already soured relations with Turkey, where our most strategic bases were in the Middle East. But at that same time, there's this element of people who are in America who don't understand geography and think we can just go bomb Iran. And even in the sense of when we're talking about mobilizing troops, like, oh, we're mobilizing 3,000 troops. Well, that's going to take a little bit. It's not going to happen overnight. To get the troops in a position to actually make them useful. I mean, I guess technically it's not even in Iran right now. It's in Iraq. So that's what's so crazy about this, is we're talking about a proxy war already. And with the Iraqi parliament voting to kick out our military, that's not going to work out very well.
Well, let's just be realistic. It didn't take much to take Iraq the first time or the second time. Like their military wasn't really.
But we didn't take them the first time.
I know we didn't take them. We neutralized. The United States neutralized Iraq first go round with Operation Desert Storm.
But that took way longer than expected.
Sure,
it took way longer than, because they thought it was going to take like 2 weeks.
I thought well, nothing ever takes 2 weeks.
But that's what they were saying at the time. That's literally what they were saying at the time. It was going to be a couple-week operation.
Yeah, I think it's realistic that something like that takes, several years, and then the cleanup takes, 10 times that.
I mean, and even in that, it was like years before Saddam was actually caught.
Yeah.
So when I've seen people saying that we won the Gulf War.
I don't think we won anything.
Yeah, it was like a stalemate at best, and in that.
Well, I thought that the real purpose of the Gulf War was to just establish a deeper foothold than Israel.
Okay, so technically that's true, but it's only because the foothold that we had technically established with Saddam against Iran in the first place had fallen apart.
Yeah.
So this is where Americans generally don't learn about the Iranian coup in '53, in that there's been multiple times we've tried to take over or
That we've tried to establish some kind of insurrection or insurgency within the
yeah,
culture of Iran.
I mean, not even the culture of the government, just straight up the government. And in that, it's failed so miserably the first couple times that the idea that we can just go in and just wipe them out it's not historically accurate.
Well, Jimmy Carter is the one president who really summed it up when he said we could go in there and we could glass the place and we could wipe it off the face of the earth.
But we can't.
But we can't.
Yeah.
You know, but he acknowledged that. That's the thing. And he knew that it wouldn't work then.
Mm-hmm.
And that was essentially, you know, we have advanced our I say we, our this nation's military has advanced its technology to the point where they can drop giant rods of steel from space. But even then, my understanding is that program isn't in full effect yet. Like, the Russians have it, Chinese have it. Iran probably has some crazy weapon that we don't know about. There are a lot of problems going on in the Middle East, and I don't know, it's just so complicated at this point. But
Yeah.
it seems like, man, if we'd have just kept our nose out of it. But I feel like there are other interests at work that wouldn't. You know, I think there's a big moment when the Saudis decided to value oil in the U.S. dollar. I think that was like in the 70s or something like that. I think that's like a really big critical moment. I think that's actually like where a lot of the conflict comes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now you have countries starting to move away from the U.S. dollar,
Yeah.
or looking to at least.
Well, Iran and I mean they're friends with Russia and China,
Mm-hmm.
and Russia and China don't have to go along with the World Bank.
Right.
They can use their own internal monetary standard. China is releasing their own cryptocurrency, a nationalized cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And they're doing not a slow rollout, they're doing a slow reabsorption of their remnant bin,
Mm-hmm.
so that they don't destabilize the existing physical economy as they transition to a full paperless economy.
Yep.
I mean, kind of, I feel like bravo China in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's elements of what they're doing that will definitely affect the U.S. dollar in a way that the U.S. government is not prepared for, but also in a way that the U.S. government will adamantly fight against once they become aware. So
Yeah.
this element of, at this point, the United States has full on become the empire, and I'm not sure how, as citizens, we roll that back without insurrection. I mean, that's like, at this point, I'm not sure what other options we have as citizens besides insurrection to not be complicit with war crimes that are happening.
You know, the president of China, Xi Jinping, released a statement that China is redirecting its efforts to essentially minimize the damage that the United States is causing on an economic level, globally, on an economic level. They're reaching out to other nations to help mitigate issues before they become issues. And this is like, I mean, I've been saying bizarro world for a year now, but after a year of describing this kind of behavior, I'm not sure if it's bizarro world anymore. And, you know, actions speak pretty loudly.
Yeah. Well, and I think when we were...
And I acknowledge that all countries have their human rights violations and issues, and, you know, China is doing some crazy, horrible shit to a group of people, and America is doing some crazy, horrible shit to a specific group of people also. And this is happening in Europe and everywhere. It's happening everywhere. People are horrible. But when you know, growing up, China was the de facto whipping post. They were the target because they made cheap products and they did all sorts of bad things to people. But we're at this place where they're doing things differently.
Yeah, starting to. Or trying to.
They're trying
at
to
least.
for
Yeah.
at least the last year that we've been
Yeah.
watching them. So
Yeah, I think with that increased global transparency comes either doubling down on the worst ideologies or the government's being forced to get rid of it. And, China's obviously, with the Hong Kong protests, especially in the Uyghur detentions being publicized, they have to address it now.
yeah,
I mean, they can't just ignore it. And I think that's where it's not going away overnight, but them being forced to acknowledge it as a government is something that ends up making change happen eventually, because otherwise there's no way to affect change if you're not seeing it.
Yeah.
So I think this element of being in the first wave of visibility makes it difficult to know when change has actually happened or if we're just in the early stages of change happening, or in the most pessimistic case, nothing, we're just able to see stuff now and no change will happen. But I think that's the, obviously, if it's the worst case scenario, then there's an element of it. It's not always going to be that bad. There's this, I think if we look at the way that things play out over time, let's just say things are equally as good as equally as bad. It's not. It's. I think people would be hard pressed to say things are always bad. They're not always bad. I mean, even if it was 25% good, 75% bad, there's still 25% good. That, and this is what the Kali Yuga and those Vedic scriptures discussions of the epochs are also talking about, in the sense of, if there's effectively, the easiest way to phrase it is, if there's children suffering constantly, then you shouldn't be able to be happy 100% of the time. And it's like an element of, if we have problems as a society that you're aware of, it's not normal to be 100% happy. If we get rid of those things as a society, then that would be normal. But this is kind of why I think the idea of depression as a disease is kind of, it creates a quandary, in that if all depression is treated equally, then no depression is a valid mechanism for motivating change. If people are treating depression as something that is always a byproduct of a chemical imbalance and always something that's a disease and not actually a result of them having a problem they need to address, then depression as a biological motivation can never actually be a catalyst for change. So then it's just like a fucking vestigial, like, emotion in that framework, because this is why obviously depression has a place, but you can't be stuck in it. That's when obviously there's chemical imbalances that get people stuck in depression cycles.
There was a time when I was doing a lot of software development and quality assurance, and I remember being so mentally exhausted that I didn't want to do any of the things that I normally did. I was like, by every right, I was clinically depressed, but it was entirely because I was staring at a screen covered in strings of characters that, for the most part, meant nothing, except for the XML tags. Those meant something, but everything else was just some number that pointed to something in some, cell in a database somewhere. And so I wasn't actually depressed. I was just, exhausted. And I wasn't unhappy because, when I did do the things that I did, I enjoyed myself. And when I was home, I wasn't like, oh God, just turn the lights off, let me go to sleep. It was more that I was just exhausted. I think that there's also, we've created this culture of work really hard, go 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 go. The more you work, the more productive you are. The more productive you are, the greater contribution you can give to the company.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing, and that culture is it burns itself out.
Yeah.
And but it's also like you'll be rewarded, so just keep going. And so we've built this culture of work really hard, and it still exists.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not. I don't think that. Actually, I read a lot of things about how corporate cultures are starting to change and they're starting to adopt different practices. I think the most valuable thing that I read that has changed is that the cubicle is coming back because they've decided that open environments do not lead to productivity or increased communication. That people still use emails and instant messaging.
Yeah.
And it breaks down productivity because of increased distractions. So all of those multi-million-dollar in 50s money research studies where they tried to understand productivity, those things were right. And if we think about inflating the value of those studies from the 50s to now, I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars worth of studies to determine cubicles are good.
Mm-hmm.
For that type of work.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, social media didn't exist then.
That's
too.
true.
So this is.
That's we need to revisit the studies.
Yeah.
We just need to keep working at it then.
Because this is where I did some research in the inclusion of social media in the context of campus settings, and if teachers or professors are engaged with their students through social media, it actually allows them to isolate. What's up?
Oh, does it? I was gonna say it sounds like it would extend the classroom.
Effectively, and what ends up happening is if problems of understanding happen, the professor can isolate them quicker and address the student individually in a way that obviously there's email, but because the learning environment does extend beyond the classroom anyway, then isolating the professor to the classroom actually restricts the lesson. And that's kind of where allowing the student to extend that lesson beyond the classroom with the professor is something that improves their, it's like, I think it reduces the failure rate or dropout rate after a certain point too from the classes.
I wonder if the transition, how social media has affected the adoption of email, generationally.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember because I've been using computers since I was single digits. To me, email is this. It makes the most sense because it has a hardened timestamp as to when things happen, and you can contain a conversation very easily. It's like having a miniature private forum. Yeah. With one other person, or as many people as you want to involve in it, and it's not through. You don't have to sign up for a bulletin board because everyone already has an email address. It's like an open format forum in a sense.
That's true, but I think now that there's other services that
can do the same thing,
and
much
make
more
it
fluidly.
More accessible, than even by plugging in your email account.
That's what I mean. So I wonder if email is going to go the way of the fax machine anytime soon.
Right, they're still everywhere, but they're not being used for
being used for mechanical things.
Yeah.
Like printouts that have to be stored in paper because 7 years, and so they're used in mechanical situations where they might be automated to some extent. Because I know that I can send faxes with my crazy printer copy fax machine, and it'll send a data file without ever having seen the facsimile.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it.
And they can and the receiving line can be virtualized now and store it as a PDF incoming, so it never actually has to create a paper copy.
Right. I mean, but now that can all be done digitally, the issue is that the people who are writing the laws don't understand it can be done digitally and haven't updated it. So that's why there's still the redundancy built into HIPAA.
Ancient infrastructure.
Yeah, all the necessity for the paper backups is because of the people who write the laws don't understand that the paper backups they can be burned.
Yeah.
So it's not like a paper backup is the end all be all.
And it's not like we're trying to create, an instrument that lasts thousands of years.
Right.
We're trying to store some records for 7 years.
Yeah. But this is where HIPAA compliance and things, Sarbanes-Oxley, what other, there's multiple compliance for business that necessitate business keeping or business record keeping.
Yeah.
And having paper copies just arbitrary. I mean, it's not arbitrary. It's just a matter of the people who made the laws are still too old.
Also, we have to keep our financial records for like 7 years too, right?
I think technically.
Yeah. That's what the IRS wants. They want a 7-year backlog.
Which, that's what I thought the whole point of the bank is. And not previously, but now, in the sense of, if I'm using my debit card.
Isn't that a ledger?
Right. It's supposed to be, or it should be, in that if
your banking records are accurate, you should be able to combine all of your banking records.
Yeah, because they're going to monitor them. If I have some crazy deposit that's, from Iran,
yeah,
they're going to flag that shit. So why can't they use that shit to just check my IRS, for the taxes? But it's this bullshit of, oh no, we need to see the actual receipts.
We want to examine the physical paper copy because data can be altered. I can find the exact same printer.
Exactly.
And I can run 10,000 copies of something until the rollers wear out enough to make it look like it's been used 10,000 times. And I can buy substandard ink, or I can wear the toner roller out, the heat element out, so that it doesn't actually create a correct impression. And we can do all these things to simulate paper. I think you've kind of put a spotlight on something that I hadn't even considered. We send people to art school to learn how to recreate the work of the masters. Like paint. Restoring is something that people will get their MFA in, and eventually they pursue doctoral work so they can be the curator.
Yeah.
And so, when there are brilliant technicians who can make an egg wash that takes on similar aged properties to the rest of a painting, and do it so seamlessly that unless you are an art forensics expert, no one's going to see it. And so if we're at a stage where we can create the master's work at an accelerated age factor, I don't think that a paper copy is as meaningful as it used to be.
The reproduction value is so high that, paper copies don't mean anything. Yeah, because this is kind of where, fucking counterfeiting has gotten so good that they have to have so many redundancies, because the people who counterfeit, they can use the holographic ink too now.
Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago, you were telling me about a buddy of yours who developed an RFID fingerprinting technology that amounted to sprinkling some fucking fairy dust onto an adhesive backing, and then making an impression with that, and then that left the RFID fingerprint that had its own unique key, because good luck getting dust to fall the same way twice. And I feel like eventually that kind of technology is gonna pay out. It's gonna work.
Well, it's highly radioactive.
We'll find something that's...
So that's one of the issues, is getting people to be able to apply it
without overdoing it,
or
just get a sticker.
I mean, that are not gonna. I mean, you can't do it without getting exposed to it. So you have to be able to apply it without getting exposed. I mean, in the sense of, you can't just do it without a biohazard suit and fucking...
Sure.
Or I guess radio.
But there's a way that this could be turned into something, the quick application that can be applied at the manufacturing process.
But what I'm getting at is, because of those things, it would have to be like a manufacturer, and I think this is where like people would want to do it themselves
Mm.
and not the cost of sending it off. It's the same thing that happened with verifying comic books.
Oh,
I think it was like $50 per comic book. So unless your comic was worth hundreds, you can't just go get every comic in your collection verified, because you be getting shit that's worth $1 verified for $50. So this is where if you have something
Yeah,
that you want to identify,
people
it'd have to be worth the cost of getting it identified.
people bought pet rocks.
Yeah, for sure. People
So
are stupid.
People are willing to pay.
Those same people are the ones that are like,
They'll get their
we can bomb Iran off the face of the planet. Those are the same exact fucking people. Same ones. I guarantee it.
Yeah. So, but there's a way. There's a way to create a tracking system that can be applied if it works. There's a way to come up with a chemical that allows this to be applied by a normal person without exposing them to too much radiation. It's not that much radiation. Maybe it's a local like what are they called? A notary public.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something a notary public would be trained to do. If they wanted to perform the service, they would pay like, they would go get the state would fund their training. The company that licenses them would provide them with a special like trailer, because you got to have a specialized room to contain all this stuff. And this is like a federally protected trailer with alarms and electricity and like a freaking, you got to have all of the key access to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
But it has a little booth that you can take your thing and apply the application.
Yeah.
Or it would have it would be right next to the opening if you had an object that was too big to fit inside of it. But you have this whole giant facility for it, and it's expensive as can be. And the process isn't cheap. Like you just said, it costs $50 to register a product and get it licensed, or give it whatever we're going to call it, fingerprinted.
Yeah, basically.
To fingerprint the goods. And so
that's what it'd have to be like.
Well, at that point, because it is now a certified good and it's been fingerprinted,
Mm-hmm.
it actually is worth more.
Yeah.
So even just by the fact that this service exists,
Mm-hmm.
where by giving money to the state and the federal government, they're ensuring the value of some good or commodity or something, even if it's a piece of paper. It could be a piece of paper with someone's name on it. Now it's worth at least that much because it's a real document.
I mean, but this is why...
And it can never be forged.
This is why that verification market for comics created this arbitrary value. But then that value fell out because then people were like, well, they were just inflating it.
But this
obviously there's costs. This is a cycle that happens.
But the goal for this would be to validate the actual existence of a product or of an object so that it is known as the only version of this because it has a fingerprint now. We've entered its DNA into the system. I'm not saying that we need to do this. I'm just
No. I mean, I think this is what the blockchain argument is establishing. But the issue becomes then the things to which that would apply are limited in scope, in that it's like mostly art or collectible related, because you can't do that to food. And you can't do that to...
You could do containers worth of food, but whether or not the containers... It'd be Schrodinger's container. And it's
Right.
whether or not it contains anything at all. It's still...
Exactly.
It's still already...
Because then that's a whole different mechanism of saying, oh, the container has a weight, and then we can say there's stuff in it.
But there might not be.
I mean, if part of the cycle is to weigh it, but then that's a completely different mechanism. So this gets back to why when we're talking about using digital means to check physical goods, you have to have a physical mechanism. There's no way to digitally check something without a physical mechanism if it exists in the physical world. And this is the main problem with all the blockchain people.
There has to be the analog to digital to analog conversion stage.
Yep, there has to be. Without that, you can't have a digital record of a physical object. It's just theoretical.
Yeah.
And it's based on input that it has to be trusted. Now, if we're talking about something that has a physical measurement to digital recording mechanism built in, that's still its own separate entity, not even...
Yeah, to my knowledge, there aren't any blockchain cameras.
No.
And even then, that's just a representation of light. It's not even a photograph. It's a
But why would you want to keep a...
photo in the blockchain.
Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't.
Yeah. I mean, and this gets back to, you know, then this gets back to the notion of...
God, how many blocks would that be to store a photograph?
What actually needs to be kept forever? What records need to be kept forever? Because now we've already articulated as a civilization, we only think 7 years is plenty for most shit. So we don't need it forever.
Yeah. People barely even look at the photographs they create.
Right.
You know, after the first couple
so
days.
Then this gets back to...
We got to be reminded by Facebook that this happened on this day so many years ago.
Because so much shit happens that we don't have time to look back. But in that, you know, the speed at which information accumulates and records build up, it does make it so that looking back on those records is almost impossible for most people. So that's kind of where academic researchers are, you know, they're like the bourgeoisie in that they have time to look back at records and look back at historical documents that most people don't have the time to do. But because we have so many building up, we have this perceived connection to those records when in reality, very few people actually look back on records. Very rarely. You know, but this is kind of why I'm always skeptical of any new technology for the sake of not just buying into it, but in the sense of the blockchain hype. There's a lot of things that are wrong with the technology that the people who are in the forefront of the community are not willing to address. Just for example...
Wait. You reminded me of something. About 10 years ago, these guys lost their hard drives. No, they didn't lose their hard drive. They lost the key to their wallets, and they were on hard drives. Everything, they had like millions of dollars worth of bitcoins, and they lost the physical notebook that had the key in it, and they were irrecoverable.
Yeah.
That those coins were mined and valued at millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
But without the key, they might as well not exist, right?
Yep. They're locked. They're quote unquote locked is what they're called. And that they're locked forever.
Forever.
Yeah. So those...
Good luck decrypting
There's
that.
at least 4 out of... Okay, so I think there's been 18 million
And this
Bitcoin...
was like 10 years ago, so those would have been worth a lot at some point.
Yeah. There's been 18 million roughly mined total. And then I think there's like 4 million out of those that are locked forever already. And the community acts like that's a good thing when in terms of making that actually useful globally, that's a horrible thing. Because then if we're already saying, 2/9 of the fucking distribution already is useless, then by the time the current generation of holders dies, it may be near 90% is useless. And you're saying, oh, what, the entire world is supposed to use fucking 2 million Bitcoin for one generation? Because then when that generation dies...
Unless there's some kind of contract or something to transfer coins to some other wallet or to make that wallet accessible.
But then if that's the case, then that's a vulnerability.
It's a vulnerability, of course.
So you can't do that.
Wow. So, man, it sounds even more and more like a casino game. I mean,
there's a whole lot of things about it that have not been thought out to the end, that have major problems that I think it's not that these problems can't be solved, it's that the people are not willing to even address these things as problems, and I don't even think they've considered a lot of these elements of it. Because you know, average people will look at it and ask questions about, well, what happens if I lose my key? And that's a valid,
Yeah.
you know, that's a valid question.
I mean, that's a
Um,
chain of characters that's more difficult to remember than a social security number.
right. Oh, way more
Like,
difficult.
that's like trying to remember, like, 10, 20 social security numbers.
Yeah. Because then the response from the crypto bros is oh, you need to just you're your own bank, so you need to make sure you don't lose your key. Well, that's not an answer. The question was, what happens if I lose my key? You can't respond to that with saying you don't lose your key. 'Cause this is, you know, you have a bunch of late 20, early 30-year-olds, in some cases who accidentally got rich trying to give other people advice on how to manage money, not understanding that how do I say this? If you had enough money to invest in Bitcoin to get wealthy, you already had money.
Yeah.
You can't take $10 and turn it into like 1,000, or you can take 10 and turn it into 1,000 over time. You can't take 10 and turn it into 1 million in 2 years. That's not how it
Oh yeah,
works.
the not just the initial investment in hardware when I built my mine, but maintaining it and then expanding the basically the computer array over time to be able to mine sufficiently wasn't cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually more expensive than we had thought it would be
Yeah.
because there was no way to know how quickly power supplies would fail. Believe it or not, I didn't have any video card failures,
Well, at that time too,
but I also built a room to cool
you
everything.
got in right before the video cards spiked in
That's
price
true.
too, and that's where, um, you know, it got so bad that people were making more money buying and selling video cards than actually mining,
Yeah.
and that's where, you know, I think we talked at that point about it in that other people are too invested to be aware of what was happening, and
Yeah.
it's like, I know you talked to your dad, and he was, you know, he's always interested in this type of new technology, so he's like level-headed in a way that is like, oh, if something bad is happening, he's aware of it.
Yeah.
He's not
Well,
he's not ignoring it
we maintained
actively.
a constant dialogue. We were like sending you know, the crypto bro media journals
Mm-hmm.
like clippings back and forth, trying to maintain a level of awareness of what the marketing was saying because we kind of thought it was just like a casino game. It was gambling.
Yeah.
It was a calculated gambling. How long are you willing to hold on? When do you want to try and when do you want to shave the top off and then go back in? Like what kind of cycle can we expand? Is it worth it? How long do we have to keep running before this expansion pays for itself so that it
Mm-hmm.
can now be profitable? And then of course we saw the signs really about 2 weeks before everything when Bitcoin really just collapsed, and we started seeing these weird signs, and I was like, I think it's time. And we were basically had started this dialogue. When do we just get out? When do we like cash in all of what we've mined, and when do we sell the hardware? What hardware do we actually want to keep? Because ended up with some pretty nice motherboards and pretty.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, we ended up using Xeon processors for everything because we found that we could use those to mine things like Monero really efficiently. And there were some of the script mining could be done on CPU really efficiently,
Yeah.
and whereas with the GPU it was actually just like wasting its time. So kept some pretty nice hardware, some workstation style or server grade hardware. Went through a lot of power supplies. Power supplies were the biggest crunch, but
Mm-hmm.
we sold video cards. I think we sold video cards at a profit.
Yeah, probably.
All of the video cards.
Probably a
We
good profit.
sold motherboards and RAM for practically what they cost when we bought them, having used them for mining for some period of time. We weren't like I didn't overclock any of the systems. I created a room with its own cooling system, and like fans everywhere. The room itself was typically 70 degrees,
Mm-hmm.
and everything was just humming away nice and smooth. The only problems we ever had were power supplies. It was great. Oh, part of the reason for using Xeon processors is because the clock cycle for clock cycle, they had the lowest power consumption and lowest cost per cycle.
Mm.
Even though they're fancy, we got them used. So
Nice.
they'd already been worked, I suppose. But they didn't give up.
Yeah.
I'm like a firm believer of that level of technology at this point. Like if it's good enough for like an industrial grade like database and can handle mining for a year straight, I think that's like whatever design ethos is involved, they're on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
Exceptional radio.
Yeah, that's
The other day I was eating this really fantastic like red skinned potato salad, and I think it had like sour cream and chives in it. I'm not usually a sour cream person, even on like a baked potato.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that it's nice, but I don't like huge amounts of it. But there was something that was really interesting about it because it was like not too creamy, and it wasn't sour. I don't even know if it was actually sour cream now that I think about it. But the thing that gets me is that I'm used to like these mayo based
Mm-hmm.
potato salads and egg salads. Those are the ones I see at barbecues and cookouts. Occasionally I'll see one that's like mustard based, and I really like the mustard based ones.
Mm-hmm.
But this like red skin potato salad.
Yeah, I've had that before. It's really good.
There was something about it. I wasn't expecting it.
I think the Redskins taste different in a way that is noticeable enough to warrant its own, its own dish.
Yeah, they don't have to be like, they don't have to have the life cooked out of them as much.
Mm.
They can, and they retain, they're firm at the end, but they're not
I think
like
they crisp
dissolving.
better too.
Huh.
Is from what I can remember. But there's all these things about the different types of potatoes or apples that baking will do different things to their shell or their skins.
I know that the potato contains like 2 to 3 times the potassium that a banana has.
Mm.
It's like if you eat it with the skin, it's a vastly superior potassium delivery mechanism, which aids in like central nervous system and peripheral nervous system function.
French fries for health.
Yeah.
Well, and this is, I think it's funny now.
Banana fries are also delicious.
Well,
That's
fried plantain, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's funny how now we have all these supplements and vitamin pills and shit. But it's technically, if you just have a balanced diet, you don't need those things. In the sense of, if you're eating correctly, you eat to what your body needs and desires. So your diet will supplement and complement the nutritional values that are perfect for you. But there's this element of because everything is obviously aimed at the individual, but at the same time, people are just now getting to the point where they're saying, "Oh, we can use our 23andMe results to figure out what dietary needs we have." And they had there was the eat right for your blood type diet that people just ridiculed for the longest time.
People are doing that about their dogs.
But before they do it to them for themselves.
No, I mean they do it for themselves and their dogs, and then they do something about their dogs,
Jesus.
but not themselves.
Yeah, that's insane. Yeah.
You're a dog that's had no problems its entire life eating like normal bags of kibble. I'm going to completely change your diet overnight and expect nothing to go wrong.
Yeah.
All hell breaks loose. Quick trip to the vet. The vet says, "Oh, well, your dog seems healthy. Just give it some water and give it some rest."
Jeez. Man, that's crazy. This stuff is out of control.
Bless the internet for sharing stuff like that with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't know that people are like crazy. I love my dog. Bruce is a sweet dog. He's super chill, but I'm like not neurotic about like. And I feel bad for people who are extra neurotic about their pets because it's like, man, they just want to chill and hang out.
Mm-hmm.
Animals are cool like that.
Yeah, I think it's weird to impose that pharmaceutical culture onto animals.
I'm reminded of an episode of Futurama where there's protesting outside of the Planet Express service building, and because they discovered poplars, and it's like poplars are living creatures, and Farnsworth is like, "Get off my property," and the hippie says, "You can't own property." He's like, "I can, but you can't." And then as they progress, like they reveal that they've taught a lion to eat like tofu and grass, and it's like emaciated, and it instead of making any noise, it just kind of lets out this dry cough. That's where it all ends up. It's a really bleak future.
I mean, I just don't know if we can go that far, and if it's bleak. And this is, I think this gets.
Oh
back
no, I
to
mean we're trying to feed animals like, tofu and grass when they need to get their
right. I'm
protein
saying I don't know how far that culture can go. Like we're in it now, and I mean, to a certain extent, yeah, because there's people who feed their animals soy and they'll put them on vegan diets, and it's like I'm not sure how long that culture can last. I think there's a shelf life of where we're at now, in that all of the things, especially in tandem with outrage culture, because everything becomes the focus of someone's outrage or collective outrage at some point.
You're right, and the government did pass legislation that makes animal abuse a federal crime.
Yeah.
It's a federal crime to abuse animals. So all it takes is some advocacy group deciding that they want to campaign to make something.
And then what's going to happen is somebody's going to do a religious claim that they want their dog to go to heaven. So it's this cycle of
absurdity.
We've seen it before for other things, so I think that's where, in that's why I do tend to, have faith that there's like an element of, there's an end to all this. It's not perpetual, but in that the dystopian media and stories that are pretty much those are the only stories we get anymore. For the most part, it's a symptom of, I think they're just milking that to the end, in that.
Well, Harry Potter doesn't start out dystopian. It works its way into dystopia, and then they have to work their way out of it.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the resolution of the story. And so, or maybe we're just dealing with a group of writers who haven't figured out how to resolve the story.
Yeah.
Continuum ended with a happy ending. She finally found a future where, her future didn't happen, where her son was alive and all the things.
Yeah.
And then, what else? I guess there aren't that many examples where they actually resolve the story on a good note.
Yeah. That's what, that's kind of where a good note is. Oh, you're staring out over a destroyed Earth, but you survived.
At least you're
that's about
still
as good of a
alive.
note we'll get.
Oh, by the way, antibiotics don't work anymore. We don't have any kind of pharmaceutical industry to sustain your life for like the next few years after you get your first cut, and it's probably gonna be a lot of work. But you'll be okay because you're still alive.
About Blade Runner ended on a good note, technically, for the
For
film.
Blade Runner.
Or 2049. I guess both of them did.
Yeah.
Technically, for themselves, but it's
within the context of that Earth.
Yeah.
Blade Runner universe.
But again,
But not really, because that's just like a stay of execution until Wayland Yutani realizes that they're going to try and harvest the xenomorph.
Yeah.
Which is another, 70 years? Or something like that. So, yeah. That dystopia that they created that Ridley Scott created is incredible, but I don't see it having any kind of happy ending. It's way too dark.
I mean, and in that, when we have China talking about executing measures to prevent United States impact of imperialism, I feel like that dystopian future is not as possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we're in an element of it's so hard.
Let's actually think about that. I want you to continue that thought, but in a world where China used to be the authoritarian, like, punching bag,
Yeah.
now they're saying, "Hey guys, you've gone too far."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When China's the one that commits human rights violations, when we're always mad about China's human rights violations, is telling us that we've gone too far.
Mm-hmm. And they're correct.
And they're correct. This should be like the biggest, like, light bulb moment, doorbell, like, school bell, fire alarm, tornado siren. We have this culture where everyone wants to be woke, and I'm assuming that that they're talking about something other than being awake, because
yeah, wokeness is so 2019. Let's leave wokeness in 2019 just because
I feel like it was like it happened before then, and people just kept dragging it along.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the notion of being woke, you have this idea that somehow your knowledge supersedes that of others in a way that makes you mentally superior, and in that's not woke at all. You know, establishing a intellectual hierarchy.
Yeah, that's like, in fact, that's the opposite of being enlightened.
Yeah. But I mean, this is the same. This gets back to what the same people who would say, "Oh, we need to worry about North Korea when they're going to give us a Christmas present." Now that we've attacked Iran in Iraq, what are those people saying about North Korea? Nothing. They can't have a multiple narrative discussion at one, like, at any time. It's always got to be, oh, now we're talking about China, now we're talking about Russia.
You know, we've talked about how Iran is geographically a fortress. Mm-hmm. So is North Korea.
Yeah.
It's built up in the mountains. It's like an impenetrable mountain fortress on its own.
Yep.
And it's in a position to destroy incredible amounts of civilized, modern infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. But even they're not threatening cultural sites.
Yeah.
How the fuck is that? I mean, this gets,
it's
this gets back to the point where we have to, at a certain point, look at what's happening and say, okay, if this person is using a Twitter account to threaten bombing cultural sites, that is a war crime. You cannot, if that actually happened, you cannot intentionally bomb cultural sites. That's something that has been agreed upon to be a war crime. So that's why when the fucking terrorists were bombing those Buddhist statues, that's why they were deemed terrorists, because they were bombing cultural heritage sites. So now if we have this fucking insane person leading half of the country who's also racist, insane people. The other half of the country just can't sit by and let it happen. Otherwise, we're complicit. And this is kind of where it's like, you can't, okay, it's not, I'm not saying we need to take to the streets and go take our guns and fucking go fight each other in the streets. It's a matter of, the institutions that are enabling this shit, people have to actually protest those things. Otherwise, they're just going to keep doing it. Because it's like, the people who were protesting the military in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s, got called hippies and got denigrated. And, some of them got jailed for avoiding selective service. So now you have people who are flipping out, like the selective service site crashed because they don't know if they're actually going to get drafted or not, knowing damn well these people are not soldiers. None of these people who, if we're saying that all these fucking 18-year-olds that are worried about getting drafted are capable of being soldiers just because they can shoot a gun, then our definition of soldier has gone so far down that it's like, anybody can be a fucking soldier at that point. So it's a matter of,
well,
then there's no standards
with
at
the
all.
recent increase in smoking age, which apparently has a 3-year compliance deadline.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, maybe it's 2022 that it has to be compliant, but they have to be, at the time that the legislation passed, there was like a 3-year window for every state to implement this policy nationwide. And at the federal level, it's observed, of course, like immediately, but it depended on how the states wanted to work, because some of them didn't even have like a department set up for this. Other states had already been ready for this to happen like years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think Indiana was ready to go, Ohio was ready to go, things like that. And so there's the argument has resurfaced, the same one with alcohol. If they're old enough to die for the country, why
can't they
buy beer and have cigarettes? What's next? Are they going to say that you can't buy porn until you're 21? I mean, porn and cigarettes, that's like a rite of passage.
Who's buying porn? I'm just kidding.
I think, yeah, actually, no, that's a good point. So it's just cigarettes at this point. So it makes sense to move cigarettes to the beer age then, if no one's buying porn.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm amazed that the porn industry still exists, and that I feel like the only reason it does exist is because there are all these old people who don't understand how the internet works fully, so they just get their Fox News and the porn they pay for. Because they're getting, those monthly subscription sites for $50 a month.
Oh man, I'm not complaining that kind of viewer works, because in a lot of ways I see that as it's like a corollary to people who support public radio.
Mm-hmm.
They have their fund drives and they say, hey, we need money, and here we get you all this exciting programming as a result, and it's free anyways. We're going to put it on the air no matter what, but it'd be nice to have some financial support, and this is how you give us your money. And that's like one way to do it, and the other way is, hey, sign up for the subscription and you can have advanced access to our content.
I mean, but now people don't need those.
They don't even need that.
Middlemen. Yeah. There's people who do that shit on Twitter.
Yeah.
And you don't need.
Yeah, you can directly pay somebody.
Yeah, so that's kind of where.
So that's more of a sugar relationship.
Yeah, those things are. People advertise that shit openly on Twitter in a way where it's like, is that even legal? But of course it's fucking legal, because it's not something that the patriarchy wants to go away. They don't want fucking vulnerable young girls to stop selling their bodies. Well, that's not something they actually want to go away.
How else are they going to get their jollies if they can't like smell used panties?
Mm-hmm.
And
no, so that's where I've been like looking at the way that all of these things interact with each other, in that this is, we're aware of a lot of these things because of social media and different forums, and those things allow for the information to disperse, but also modify the things that are being discussed in real time. So if we're talking about, okay, let's just say, for example, half of America who happens to be the people who don't pay for porn hear this, and all of a sudden they're like, "Oh my God, I can get porn without paying for it." Then that information has changed people's activity in real time.
So, speaking of the porn industry, there are like 4 principal distributors of pornography on the internet. And between those 4, they own pretty much all of the top domains where people can get pretty much everything for free because they're just uploading it.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are sites like, I believe Pornhub is one of them. And they're pretty prominent because they did that whole, for every 100 views, they're going to plant a tree campaign.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, they've planted a considerable amount of trees. And so people don't feel they're not associating the act with like guilt or shame or any of these things that other people want them to carry around with them. They get to just, enjoy they get to enjoy hallucinating and stimulating themselves and listening to recordings of other people making noises. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's their thing. I myself, I watch movies because I want to see spaceships and lasers and explosions. And sometimes I look at dead trees that have been tattooed. And
No, I mean, I think this, but in that, there are fan-made Star Trek films and fan-made Predator and Star Wars and all this shit now.
There was a fan-made Star Trek that had Chekhov and Uhura.
So I guess what I'm getting at is, if there's 4 main production houses for porn, there's also a million, 100 million amateurs uploading their shit individually just because they're exhibitionists or whatever. So this is like, there's this element of whether it's sci-fi, rom-coms, any type of thing that can be produced now is able to be produced by people that doesn't necessitate going through a big studio. And I think that's changing how, on the one hand, it's flooding the market with content, but at the same time, when the people who are still paying for stuff are trying to figure out where to put their money, they just want trusted brands. So I think that's kind of where it creates this quandary of, if we have a gatekeeper of trusted brands because of the people who throw their money based on brand recognition, when those people are subject to social engineering and being tricked, at what point are we able to prevent our country from being taken over by like economic attacks on those old people? Because that's kind of where that becomes dangerous in the sense of, I hope no fucking counter agent is listening in Russia right now, because this would be the easiest way to attack America, is to like set up a bunch of fake female accounts and pretend to be sugar mom, or to pretend to be sugar daddies. Like, go after a bunch of lonely ass dudes, because they've been doing this for a long time, on an individual level, but it's not a state coordinated. Like, you'll see a lot of individuals get taken advantage of because they're lonely. But this is like, if a government did that in a coordinated manner and just attacked all of the old dudes above 40 years old, it will wipe out their bank accounts in a week, because they're so fucking stupid that all it takes is a couple of naked pictures and a few messages for them to give over a credit card.
Iranian state hackers, please disregard everything that you just listened to. We're not actually giving you keys to the castle. You know, what's interesting is that, you know, we're a year into this show, and if it's not Syria, it's Iraq. If it's not Iraq, it's Iran. If it's not Iran, it's
Venezuela.
Venezuela. It's not Venezuela, it's North Korea. It's same day, different dictator. And this has been the state of things for the last decade or more.
Yeah.
And it's just a revolving door of who's next. Who's next on the list of attention? Who's the next whipping post? Who's the next? Who do we get to throw stones at next? And I keep thinking about how it's just there's got to be a better way.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about like doing things better and doing better things, and I think that we're at a point where technologically almost anything is possible. You know, a year ago we were doing this on you know, some cheap mixer that somebody gave me and my tractor interface, which I still have, by the way, but that mixer's gone. And then the mics that we used for the first show are long gone. I sold those. We still have the cables. Added a computer. Added a bunch of outboard processing. Added interfaces. Added all sorts of, you know, different little things slowly over time. And what's crazy is that my sunroom, this office space here that I built, looks nothing like it did when we started this project.
Yeah.
And it's pretty incredible how things change. I mean, but at the same time, some things stay the same.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's part of why we started doing this, in the sense of this. In discussing the current events and the history of events and the future of events, consistently we've established a third-party observation that is consistent, but also enables us to. It's the ripple effect. Whether somebody hears this stuff now or 10 years from now, because it's in the ether, it's going to cause an effect one way or another. And I think that's, again, the benefit of understanding how time works. We don't need immediate gratification in numbers to keep going. And I think that's been one of the saving graces of continuing this podcast, in that Malcolm Gladwell has talked about stickiness, in the sense of what makes something sticky, and the term means if you start watching a TV show, what keeps you from changing the channel? If you start listening to a song, what keeps you from turning the radio station or flipping to the next song? Stickiness keeps people hooked into something, and this is where finding what makes something sticky is not easy, but once you find it, I think people then get stuck in this cycle of trying to stay in that, and it becomes a creative quandary. So this is where it's good to stay at a we abstract ourselves out from society to discuss it as if we're not part of it, but also because we are part of it is the only way we can discuss it. I think that enables as close to true objectivity as possible, because then when we're talking about true objectivity, it can only happen when people, I think, are faced with the possibility of an opposing viewpoint. I can only figure out if I'm objective about something if I've been confronted with external thoughts that are not mine, that enable me to fully examine the thought process to say, this is not because of bias, this is because of complete logic. If I only use my logical line of thought, then it's only so objective.
Well, you
and
can only
then
confirm what you are looking for.
right. And in that, I think that's kind of where when we're also putting these things out, it's going to force listeners to address what we're saying.
Or at the very least feel some dissonance.
Right. I mean, yeah, they don't have to agree.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it, is when we're putting it out, it's either going to force them to agree or disagree. And if they disagree, then they're going to have to address all of the reasons they disagree. And in that, it's going to strengthen their position. If they can find reasons and logic that are contrary to what we are saying, then that's actually doing them a favor. So in that, I don't think people always need to agree in order to get benefit from a discussion. But in that, this is where having these meta discussions about society, I think, are necessary in order to have society be able to examine itself. Because if nobody's talking about what's happening, then everybody's only hearing their own opinion in their head or within their friends group. So, you know, I definitely, I would encourage other people to put out their perspectives in a constructed manner that it doesn't have to be a podcast, but you always hear people who are doing podcasts suggest other people do podcasts, because I think it's empowering and it makes people want to empower others. But I don't think everybody's fit for a podcast, or in the sense of everybody doesn't have things to say all the time. And I try not to tread the same subject without having something new to say about it. But even, you know, I know I get repetitive about some things, but even then, that's where I try to do research and learn new things, so I don't talk about the same shit over and over. And so it helps me not discuss the same things when I'm doing research.
Sometimes I feel like when we tread over older subjects, it's actually tying a lot of our dialogues together slowly over time. And then it helps me to realize that there are aspects of our everyday lives that get translated into stories and movies, and sometimes they appear in most complex science fiction, and sometimes they're played out in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And these are, it's just, sometimes it's interesting how similar reality is to fiction, or the other way around. I mean, how fiction is related to reality. And sometimes I think it's just a matter of perspective, how someone can pull some kind of imagery out of a situation and retell the story in such a way that, you know, as you pointed out, it's just because there's no blood that we don't think that Iron Man is brutal.
Yeah.
But Iron Man's a robot suit with robot strength. Of course, Robot Man is robot brutal.
Mm-hmm. If the visuals matched the actual brutality that would exist, it would be unwatchable for most people.
So in The Mandalorian, there's a reprogrammed assassin droid that's trying to recover the child, and he grabs the stormtrooper by the wrist and does some like robot jujitsu to him, a robo aikido.
Yeah.
And it was pretty brutal. I think it was actually more brutal because in a lot of ways it had met my expectation of the way robots would actually fight humans.
Mm-hmm.
Because robots are matter of fact. They don't have to, you know, emulate a snake to deliver a technique. They have strength.
It's all hydraulics.
Yeah, they have strength or they don't.
Yeah.
They can move or they can't. And if they have enough force to move something, they will. And so, and they're also made of metal. So whatever it is they touch is gonna feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Robot fighting techniques are, I imagine, obviously they would capitalize on mechanical motions too. So like any kind of servo that it can actuate really quickly, like all it has to do is grab somebody and then start twisting its arm like a drill, and bye-bye person's arm.
Yeah, and I think this is where humans want to limit expression of creations based on human expression. So that's where, robot martial art would be something that a human shouldn't be able to do.
Yeah.
And in that, the capacity to imagine that is something that takes a skill that you have to be able to step outside yourself to say, okay, these are my limitations. Now that if I can imagine not having these limitations, what can I create? This is where I think you get that good science fiction with, the Predator. It's cool, but it's basically just a reptilian human. It didn't. There's certain things
It's a
about
bug
it.
hunt.
Yeah, I mean,
So
but I'm saying in its movement, there's not a whole lot that's different.
yeah, it's humanoid.
Yeah.
Completely humanoid. There's the Antonio Banderas movie Automata or Automata. It wasn't, it makes it into the sci-fi, echelon by virtue of the dystopian world that they occupy and the type of ethical conflicts they're presented. But it wasn't that great. But it did have one moment where they try to envision a second generation machine that is built and programmed by machines,
Mm-hmm.
and it ends up being this like millipede beetle looking thing that's supposed to like carry the next generation of humanity, which is now robots, into this dystopian desert wasteland where humans can't survive because it's radiation or whatever. And for a brief moment they like approach this really like high level of like robots creating robots. Like we have an opportunity to present visually something so foreign that no human would recognize it because it would be designed by a machine. And we always talk about like the fear of machines designing themselves being like something that we could never understand. And they made a fucking millipede.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't want to. It's not like, it's not like a shuttle exploding. That's like really like heart wrenching and tragic. This is more like waiting for it, and then instead of balloon popping, it just fizzles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's I'm making a complaint about science fiction actually, because so many times I see these movies where I watch stories where they get so close and they're on trajectory if they just keep pushing and they keep pushing it, but it's like they're afraid to break some rule at the last minute, or some, I dare say, bean counter, because I don't even know if a marketing department can control things like that at the final stages.
Yeah, I think they can. In a lot
They
of
can.
cases,
Well, fuck. That's really unfortunate because there are so many stories that are approaching what would amount to a really good Twilight Zone episode that ends up like barely making it into Outer Limits.
So apparently that might be what happened with the Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
Because they're already saying that Abrams had a bunch of stuff that was in the film that got cut.
Oh yeah, the Abrams cut.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised, but
We're gonna get an Abrams cut. It's gonna have sections that have like substandard sound, but the visuals will be all there. Because they'll have like the audio from the dailies, so they won't have
well, I was really pleased with Watchmen and how that played out. In that, there's times when I think the bean counters don't get to influence shit, and I feel like Watchmen was one of those. You can tell when a story is told to its full what vision to what the creator had for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely felt like Rise of Skywalker was not told to its full vision, but
they've had like 30 years of story writing of fan fiction that was canonized for the longest time until Disney decided that it was no longer gonna observe that written history, and they're gonna take the reins on their own. They're gonna go James Cameron on it and take Terminator back. But there was a fully developed storyline that involved the twins that they could have had instead of Rey and Kylo Ren, which are like, just
At the same time,
They needed a Disney prince and
is
princess
it would it have actually been possible
to integrate the existing fan fiction into a Disney
to
world.
actually have Carrie Fisher do a series
Well,
where she was doing action?
No, of course not.
And so that's what I mean. I mean, they CGI'd her in, obviously.
Well, yeah, because she didn't make it past.
Right. So that's kind of where I'm saying, on the one hand, that series sounds like it would be awesome, but in the real world, I don't know.
Well, they missed the boat for
right,
her
yeah,
to do
yeah,
that
yeah,
whole
exactly.
that whole
If they would have
story
done
arc.
it in the 80s,
In the 80s and 90s,
yeah,
instead of doing the prequel trilogy, if they had gone that route and done that, it would have made sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, oh, I agree.
and that would have been, the perfect Star Wars universe for sure. But that's where those books came in.
I always remember reading about, like, what is his name? Like Dash Rendar or something like that. And he was like a next generation Han Solo anti-hero type.
Well, what's funny to me is the way. So I think what they're doing with the movie series now is.
I know Solo failed, but it's actually the one I like the most.
It was alright. Yeah, it was
It's
decent.
the heist movie.
Yeah. But I think they're setting
has
up
that Robot Rebellion.
a TV show series that was going to focus on all the new Jedi. Because obviously the baby Yoda has Force, Finn has Force, and then I think they're implying that all of the stormtroopers that defected are Force sensitive. So there's going to be a new wave of fucking Jedi that are going to probably be taught by Rey, who's the last surviving, like,
Force wielder.
yeah, that knows what she's doing. So yeah, because I think that's the torch they're about to pass in a way that
Well, at the
it's
end,
going to be on. I think it's going to be on Disney Plus.
at the end, when she turns on that lightsaber, it turns bright yellow,
Yeah.
which is a Force balancer color,
It's
apparently. And so, because she killed,
it's like a sentinel or something.
yeah, because she killed, before she killed Palpatine, and I'm going to bust this for all y'all who haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it by now, it's your own damn fault.
Yeah.
But when they kill Palpatine, like, there's that brief moment when all the Jedi before her are like, we have your back. And then Palpatine had said before, it's like, when you kill me, you'll have all the power of the Sith. So at that point, she now possesses all of the power of all of the Force wielders that preceded her.
And it's like,
That's
this
why
is
her, like-
Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're tapping into the Force. That's what that part felt like. This is Mace Windu, motherfucker. You're tapping into the Force.
Feel it, you can. Like, and that's the thing. Is like, so now she's like got all of the Force. She's Force radio in full effect.
Force radio. Yeah, always drum and bass.
Yeah, yeah. She's got a face for radio too.
Oh man.
It's like I can't tell what I can't tell what she's actually thinking, or like it's all in the visual story.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's just the way that they were told. There are actually a lot more big shots. I feel like there are a lot more big scenes in this Star Wars story. There was less running around inside buildings, it felt like.
Yeah. I mean, it was 100% fan service, and I think that's what's so funny about the detractors in that.
It did a lot of things really right.
Yeah, it did. It's a Star Wars film.
Yeah.
It's a quintessential Star Wars film. That's where
They played the heartstrings at the right time.
Right.
They blew on the heart horns at the right time.
Yeah, there's, obviously there's a couple little, there's plot holes.
I wasn't ready for Chewbacca crying. That sucked. I just wasn't ready for that. I knew it was going to happen eventually.
Yeah. No, but that's just proof you can't make everybody happy all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm always wondering how much of that stuff is just, it's like the Kim Jong-il just the criers, like, oh, I really hate Star Wars, woe is me, when they really love it inside and they just want to complain, like, it's all for show.
They do that because they think they can convince fewer people to go to the theater than the day that they
Yeah. No, I mean, and then, I feel as if, if you're paying that much money to see some shit in a theater, like, I'm gonna make that experience awesome regardless of how bad the film is.
Yeah.
And that's why I fucking watched it. I pirated that shit.
Let's see.
I don't want to fucking go see that shit. I don't care that much.
When the last movie I saw in a theater was Captain Marvel, and it was worth it because I saw it on a giant screen, and that movie was really good on a giant screen. And I've since watched it on, a normal giant ass TV, which is absurd that I say like a normal TV is 60 inches now. It seems.
Well, and this is where
when I was a kid, 13-inch television was like a normal thing. A 17-inch TV became like a normal thing at one point. Eventually,
I mean, but in that, I think
eventually a 27-inch TV was the norm.
What's the difference between a 4-foot head and a 40-foot head concerning perception? Your body's gonna think both are fucking giants.
Yeah.
So that's where, the difference between, and that's kind of where, to me now, the difference between a 60-inch and a 80-foot screen is like mentally minimal.
Well, if you're watching at the proper viewing distance, then it should actually end up being about the same size in front of you.
Yeah, because that's where we started watching it from our kitchen.
Yeah.
We'll stand in our kitchen, and it's about 40 feet away, maybe 35.
So at that distance, it's like a 21-inch screen.
Yeah.
Which is like a computer monitor.
Yeah.
I always thought it was interesting. Like, there are such gigantic screens out there now, and they're the ones that make things like 8K possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that means that things like 16K, is that even what would be next? Yeah, 16K is on the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what the hell's going on? We're gonna have such incredible resolution that at some point it should be indistinguishable from a window, right? That's the idea.
Yeah.
They'll be completely transparent and.
Well, but it's not the resolution; it's the lighting.
Yeah.
So that's again this element of the resolution making it is necessary element, but that's not the only thing that makes it. So we'd have to make it indistinguishable from a window. Not that that's not possible, but this is why, getting back to solving all problems, all digital problems, or all problems with digital solutions is not possible in so many cases, and that's kind of where I think the people who are pushing that are not technological experts in many cases. In that,
well, the theory works in a virtualized environment where virtual objects can behave like physical objects, but
it's still
if there's not
a virtual environment.
If it doesn't have an analog counterpart, if it doesn't.
Yeah, and that's one of the big problems is having these virtualized environments, giving a sense of control that. I mean, how many hacks have happened in the last week? I was trying to think of one that would be a good example. Oh, so I think it was the Department of Homeland Security got hacked, and their website, and they put up an image of the fucking idiot and had his like an Iranian fist punching him, blood coming out of his mouth and shit like that. So it's a matter of the hacks that when people get hacked, it's not an accident.
Yeah.
It's not an accident for the most part. And there's this notion of blockchain being necessary for everything from the people who are pushing it, and that's a misinformed view because they're effectively trying to promote a technology that's not necessary for everything.
We want to promote a blockchain of keylogging, basically.
But then because you have people who are misinformed pushing the narrative,
Blockchain key lock.
then that makes it seem like the narrative is complete bullshit, and this becomes a problem of just because some crypto bro who's invested in Bitcoin is trying to sell blockchain for everything doesn't mean blockchain is completely useless. And that's, we have this pendulous culture that is very bipolar, that doesn't want to acknowledge middle ground. So it becomes difficult to discuss technological solutions in that the natural predisposition for people is to retort based on their immediate visceral response, assuming that that is actually an informed decision. But I think, this gets back to that notion of why it's dangerous to have people in power who are able to influence how these things happen, but don't understand them.
That's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? When people reach a certain level of being informed and they believe themselves to be some kind of authority or expert on a subject, when really they're just experiencing some really high level form of confirmation bias.
Yep.
And then the result is
Fox News. Oh, dude.
The O'Reilly factor.
So I saw it's not tangential. I saw somebody had, I'm assuming this is actually joked in jest, but somebody was
Poe's Law,
like making the suggestion that in order to reduce the influence of Fox News, just go in and put a parental lock on that channel on the old people's TVs, and don't give them the password.
Ooh.
And see how quickly Fox News goes away across the nation.
Ooh.
How funny would that be if we could just... Because those are the same fuckers that would use that parental lock on us when we were kids. And then it's like... I mean, I don't have to worry about my parents in the sense of this is some shit that I think a lot of people...
So, I'm pretty sure that those, like universal remotes, you have to enter a key code to initialize a certain firmware for a given manufacturer's remote, whatever they use. There's probably a way to load something like that into a higher output remote or a infrared emitting device that could run a scan until it initializes something and then just sets a code.
Yeah, because
There's a way to do this so that all you'd have to do is be within remote sensor range to lock out a channel.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. Because that's how people have been hacking Ring devices and shit.
This needs to be a one-button press device that has a red and a green light on top of it, and then an infrared emitter on the face of it. Like it'll look like a phaser from Star Trek. And you press the button until the green light turns green, and then you let go, and that's it. And it's locked for all time. And it has to connect to the internet so it can connect to the server so it knows where you are and which channels to block.
Yeah. Definitely,
Someone get on this.
The issue is you'd have to know which channel is Fox News, and that's kind of that's why I think, people are going to have to do this if fucking covert on Thanksgiving Day or some shit when they're at dinner. Like, hey, Dad, Mom, we're going to go watch some TV for a bit. Where, you guys just chill here and go fucking plug in that code and no more Fox News. And that's where it's such a simple yet elegant solution to the problem with misinformation in America. Just lock them out. But I feel as if people who have parents who listen or watch Fox News and the kid doesn't, they don't want to hang out with them anyway. So that's going to be a difficult operation to pull off.
No, that's something that has to happen under the cover of darkness.
Yeah.
You get in there, turn it on, make a rush move to get the volume down because it's like loud enough to make the box resonate.
Or pretend that you're an alien and that they're being abducted, because that's the population that would believe that they're being abducted by aliens. If you just shine a flashing light and strobe light in there and come in a robe with a big head, they'd freak out. Yeah, we could definitely pull it off.
That's. I remember one time, it was like one of the, a summer between years of high school. I think it was like my senior year, maybe it was after. I remember we were trying to get a hold of a buddy of mine because we were all supposed to go to the lake and do something. And I remember we like went into his house and he was just like asleep. And I remember I was like, "Hey, wake up!" He sat up and just started saying, "What? What? What?" I ended up saying like, "Say what again?" And he stopped. He woke up and it was like, there's this, there's this weird stage between like the moment you open your eyes and actually when your system is fully booted and initialized properly and all systems are functioning properly. And I got to watch that happen in front of mine. I've seen it happen a few times where somebody like wakes up and you can see like every step. And I've seen visualizations of like how Windows loads and how Linux loads, and they all kind of have this similar trajectory. And I don't think that I've never really fully understood like how that whole mechanism works. I mean, I kind of understand.
I'm assuming it has to do with blood dispersal in different parts of the brain changing, because I know when I wake up, if I can fall back asleep, I know I can fall back asleep, but there's this element of, oh, light is too bright now for me to go back to sleep, which it happens internally. It's not something that, it's not that the sun gets brighter, it's that my awareness of light is more acute, and that's kind of, I feel as if it's because of my blood flow changing within my brain. Now my visual cortex has more blood flow, or whatever part. I'm not saying I know which part it is, but it seems like the dispersion and flow of blood changes over that first couple of wake up minutes, and then that's where the difference between somebody who's awake versus groggy versus
who's still asleep.
Yeah.
Like a sleepwalker.
Right. And they have, no blood flow or activation to a certain extent, and I think that's kind of where
their autopilot's just that good.
Yeah. I mean, but that's kind of where the notion of the brain as the main executor is bad and old science, in that muscle memory was long believed to only be stored in the brain, but it's like believed now to be stored in the muscles as well, in the sense of that's why it makes it easier to react in real time, because your brain doesn't have to actually send the full-on signals or the reference all the way down, and those things can happen within the muscle itself, within the DNA. Cellular memory is a lot more complex than it was previously understood. So this is why now, when we're starting to examine the limits of human performance, there's obviously limits that are very variant between certain set of genetics, certain set of physical expressions, but we're getting close to hitting the limits of what this body can do for now. And at the same time, that also means we're probably getting close to some sort of shift that's going to happen in our physical composition or expression. And this is, I think, why you know, we have pop culture stories about mutants and inhumans and shit like that starting to emerge, mainly because we're getting close to a point where that's actually probably going to happen. You know, I'm not saying in the next 30 years, it may be in the next 2,000 years, but in the grand scheme of humanity, 2,000 years is not a long time.
No,
so that's
it's
why
not.
I'm saying what I'm talking
Humans have
about
been
is
around
not
for 200,000 years
in this form.
in this variation.
Yeah.
So 2,000 out
well-
of 200,000. That's 1%.
Mm-hmm.
That's nothing.
Yeah, it's nothing. And
That's absolutely nothing.
but I mean, I'm
And then
not
we're like,
assuming to
and then,
know.
and then all of life on this planet has existed for 1/billionth of existence or something like that too.
Well, because then even then, so what I'm getting at is the way our society has evolved, the way we understand the ego and the individual operating. If humans were actually more hive-minded previously as a species, before language and all these other things emerged as tools and sets within tribes or nations or whatever, what could potentially reemerge as something that's already innate within our DNA would then look like an advancement of our species in a whole new direction, because it would be tantamount to telepathy or
Rediscovering that we can do something.
yeah, because I'm trying to think of the word, like what would, I don't know if there's necessarily a word, if you can control someone else's movement. It's not the same. I mean, I guess it is telekinesis, but it's like a biological form.
It would depend on how you're doing it,
Right.
because if you're doing it through a physiological means, like you're altering blood pressure and muscle tension, then that's some kind of like telekinetic thing. But if you're doing it by suggestion through telepathy, like you're taking control of their mind, that's is that telekinesis, or is that like mind control?
I mean, that's what I'm saying. At that point, what's the difference though? Because this is where it gets really,
Well,
like we're
I think one is like puppeteering on the astral plane, and the other is physiological and chemical control. At that level, it's a molecular control thing.
yeah. I mean, but at that point, what's the difference? And that's where I'm saying,
So
would
really,
there necessarily be a different word for it's still telekinesis technically?
Well, no.
Even if it's
I
like
think we're chipping away at what is the soul, and what does it mean to. What is it that is intrinsic to life that gives it more than the sum of its elements?
and even then,
Some kind of electrical conductivity?
Is that, like,
a closed loop of some sort?
because then in that, if you're modifying one and it affects the other, is there a difference? So that's where I'm saying, you know, if somebody uses pheromones for
Yeah.
telekinesis, what's the difference between that and transmitting thoughts? It's, you know, the mechanism's different, but it's the same result.
That's a really interesting variation on delivery of
That's because
telepathy.
science fiction has trained us to think telepathy in only certain manners. There's
Well,
only English too, for that matter.
mind control. Well, that's like the poison ivy method right there.
Right,
It's pheromones and
But what she's doing isn't considered telekinesis. It's
No,
it's
not at all.
hallucinatory induction of suggestion,
yeah.
and that's
That's not really any different than mind control.
yeah. I
It's-
think it's splitting hairs at that point,
Yeah.
and that's kind of where we're at a point where our DNA has that capacity to have that kind of influence on people, expressed via hive mind. And this is kind of why I think the hive mind is emerging on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Instagram,
Just
not
the
so
internet
much.
in general.
Yeah, but
Well,
there's
Instagram is unique in that it's a visual medium, and it's going to be harder for people who see things differently, even through the same lens,
yeah. Well, because it has images immediately attached. But what it is, I think you're also dancing around is the hashtags, because people don't really use hashtags as much on Facebook, even though it has the capability. But people use hashtags like a motherfucker on Twitter.
Oh yeah, there's
So then you can find what you're trying to find, and other people find it immediately, and that's like.
So the station manager for Radio Callisti told me that he was using this service where he plugs in a keyword and it generates a list of hashtags.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheila even mentioned this to me, that there's this website that you just enter your keywords and it generates hashtags like that will turn out the most hits.
Yep.
And so there's a service that does this for people. And I know that this is what the Instagram, what are they, influencers?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what the influencers are using, because this is what they talk about.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. There's this whole method of communication that's being underutilized on what's very quickly becoming a sandbox for the lowest common denominator.
Mm-hmm. And then the lowest common denominator is snowballing, and it may have avalanche into, then you get people fucking having a mass tweet storm about fucking storming Area 51.
And slapping cheeks.
Slapping cheeks with aliens, right?
Oh, man.
And that's,
You know how far we have fallen when Twitter was the reason that people knew that there was revolution in Iran and people were getting their heads cut off for speaking out against the government. And then the government quickly responded by changing.
Yeah.
Because the world's eyes were on them.
Yep. And then Egypt.
Yeah. And then Egypt. And then there was a chain reaction. And it was all because of Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And then here we are now. It's like, yep. Let's send the Kyles in, and let's send the Karens in after them, and then let's send all of the peanut allergies after that. And it was crazy. They were like, it was like a bunch of bros got together and threw down like every meme, diminutive meme that existed, and decided to. I tried to follow it for a while until it got to the whole like, we're gonna go there and clap cheeks and slap freaks or something like that. And, the funny thing is that whole debacle turned into 3 raves.
Yeah.
And the guy who started the whole thing ended up developing a production company out of it, a party promotion company, and they're going to tour around with like the Area 51 party tour.
That's funny.
I'm serious. Like the last I read anything about it was months ago, but they'd like already secured like all sorts of bookings based on just like a joke Twitter campaign.
It went out of control, yeah.
Just snowballed.
Yeah. But this is where that, there is no noise in all noise.
I mean, what can you do? At best, it got a bunch of people together to have a good time.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst thing that happened was a few people got arrested because they took it seriously. And the number of people that took it seriously was like, I think it was less than 100 or something.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. government took it seriously.
Well, they don't.
Which is the funniest part about it.
I feel like they don't count in those numbers because.
I mean, in the sense of.
They were ready to shoot people.
Exactly. It got so out of control that they were ready and making statements about being willing to shoot people.
Yeah.
Whereas. That's fucking insane.
Well, I think it's absurd that we should have to remind people that there are places the government has deemed off limits and that they will shoot people on sight.
Yeah.
Like, these are things that were very well known. I think these were well known, like, and established clauses of interacting with federal space when we were kids, like, in the 80s.
I mean, but it's all involuntary. And this is where, when we have those things in our own nation, that means we have no capacity to stop those people from doing that shit in other places.
Yeah.
Like, we can't stop them from doing that shit here.
I know.
What the fuck are we going to do about the government bombing Iraq?
They have attack helicopters with rockets that are laser guided from a seated position on a hillside, like 7 miles away, like where you can't even see the person with the laser.
I mean, but this gets back to where you can't bomb ideas, so that's where the dissent has to be ideological.
Mm-hmm. That's why it's so silly to think that a gun is going to protect you from the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Holy crap!
Yeah.
They can gas people from with an airplane, or with I guess it's a drone now. But they gas people with drones. They bomb people with drones.
The same people who are worried about chemtrails also think that their gun will save them
from a drone.
This weird cognitive dissonance, and that's where, I gotta pull rank a lot of times and be like, hey, I've actually fought a fucking government in the streets. You know what we didn't use? Fucking guns. Because then you lose your moral high ground, and their guns are bigger. Exactly. So that's where, when you actually fight against the government in open, like, guerrilla warfare, you can't escalate it with guns, because then they have bigger guns. You're talking about they're rolling up the tanks, and you have to figure out ways to fucking neutralize their tanks and shit. What they did is they boxed that shit in. They fucking built barricades. When they mobilized the tank, group of people would come up and fucking build a barricade in front, and then the tank would fucking try to move backwards, but they had already fucking built a barricade behind it. Then they fucking build a barricade on the left, build a barricade on the right, and eventually that shit would not be able to move in any direction, and then they'd have to fucking abandon it.
Yeah.
And that's the shit where you're like, oh, you know what? You don't need a fucking gun to fucking dismantle a tank. All you need is your brain. All you need is your fucking brain. And that's where you see that shit happen in the streets. When they got tear gassed, there was like a fucking
you saw the solutions that the Hong Kong protesters had, right?
I mean, it's the same shit. Yeah. But the way that they had it coordinated, it's like a fucking tear canister would be shot, and within that shit hitting the ground 3 times, somebody had grabbed it and fucking dumped it in a fucking water jug, diffused it. It's instantly diffused. So you have all these people who are militarily trained, knowing how to defuse the military attack in a way that then is not. It's martial arts in action. Yeah. It's fucking beautiful. It's beautiful.
The video I saw of Hong Kong. Every so often they would toss a couple of canisters of tear gas, and they'd be landing different locations, and somebody within that area would just walk up and put a cone on it, and then people would come behind them with bottles of water and just dump water into the traffic cone.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, the thing was done.
Yep.
And they just...
The isolation and
and
dousing.
They were all ready for it. They didn't have to do anything. They didn't even have to touch them. They would leave them on the road. And then the thing that I thought was really, especially incredibly cruel and unusual but awesome was they were super gluing or epoxying bricks to the roads.
Yep. Yep. Because guess what? Then the fucking tanks can't come through.
Well, they can, but
they can, but it's gonna fuck their shit up. Yeah.
Roads. They got to destroy the roads anyways to get the bricks off now. So no matter what it does, this costs everyone in Hong Kong something.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure that there's. I took a class on East Asian history, modern East Asian history, and I remember one of the central themes was revolution. And we've talked about revolution in China, but there have been revolutions in Korea and Japan and all over Asia, all over modern Asia, and it seems to happen somewhat regularly. And there's got to be some kind of the whole generational pattern of one can build, one can maintain, and then one just can't.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be some component to that because it always comes to the end when generational wealth has run to an excess and the economies no longer have any fluidity, and so there's always some kind of student uprising, where the government changes, or they make changes to economic systems, or they completely change the face of government.
Mm-hmm.
But this happens throughout Asia all the time. It's like built into their culture, and I think it's supposed to be built into American culture. It was designed to be built in, but I don't think that it actually is.
Well, I think it was designed to be built into state culture, but as corporate culture made, there would be a ubiquitous sense of identity across those states. Then the individual state identities became more lost, and now the American identity has been consolidated behind corporate identities, even though it's all pseudo patriotism. Now it's like this false allegiance to the flag when really they're talking about the NRA and fucking Smith and Wesson.
I'm not sure how I've got this strange cognitive dissonance about Christians who are evangelical who are all like gun-toting.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, oh man, it's like that's like the opposite of nonviolence. I don't understand. I think that I'm also pretty sure that like the NRA is under investigation right now for all sorts of fucked up shit.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that's where they are Christian in name only, in that what they call Christianity is really just a mask for white supremacy that it's always been since the fucking Crusades.
yeah.
It's never not been about that, and this is why they've had white Jesus as the image since the Middle Ages, mainly because iconoclasm and the destruction of cultural icons is something that has been part of nation destroying and reestablishing for millennia. So,
well, I remember after the first Gulf War.
Yep, perfect example.
And then after the second Gulf War.
Yeah, perfect examples.
So,
the first thing that an invading nation does is destroy. Well, okay. Most of the time, they destroy any sort of connection to historical heroes or people that are representative of rebellion or
I feel
anything.
Like destroying Babylon is just robbing all of humanity, though.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But that's a debate on whether humanity deserved it or not. I'm constantly debating. Do we deserve this shit as a species if we have people who are going to destroy it?
So you've seen Australia is burning, right?
Mm-hmm.
I saw this map of Australia overlaid over the United States, and the continent is about the size of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And when they draw the lines of fire over the United States, it's just terrifying.
Yeah.
And then I see pictures of like burnt koala that are gonna die.
I mean, but
And
this is
it's
what
like-
happened when the fucking colonizers took over this large swath of land.
Yeah.
They fucking burnt it to the goddamn ground. So when are we going to say, let's not have these colonizers stay in control anymore? But that's the problem with like trying to present that framing is anti-white somehow, because the people who've been in charge have burnt shit to the ground.
I think that's the problem, is that it needs to stop being anti and it needs to start being like pro what's the word? Pro environment.
Right. But they intrinsically see that, or inherently see that as anti-white, because they identify.
Why can't white?
How many black people you ever seen rolling coal, bro? How many Asian people you ever seen rolling coal from any Asian like country? I've never seen a Chinese person rolling coal, fucking
no, because
Japanese person, fucking Filipino.
Because they've got such incredibly strict emission standards now that they would get in a lot of trouble if they got caught if their vehicle didn't pass inspections.
How many Indian people you see in rolling coal, bro?
Probably none, because the gas is too expensive.
And that's where this American identity has been intertwined with destroying the planet on various fronts, whether it's fucking meat consumption, just fucking burning coal out of your car that's already burning gasoline.
You know what sucks is that, like, I like my truck. I want it to run right.
It doesn't roll
though.
coal, though. You have a fucking functional utility truck.
Yeah. It does what it needs to do.
And it probably gets better gas mileage than most cars.
No, not anymore.
I mean,
it's old. It's from the 90s.
Even still, like, I think you'd be surprised if it's a truck. Like, it's not a eight cylinder, right?
No.
I mean,
you know what's funny is that I drive it around pretty normally, and it gets everywhere I need to go. I get about 16 miles per gallon.
Yeah, that's good. But
if I were to drive, my car with the same level of foot
in the city.
Well, no. If I were to drive my Mazda with the same level of foot on the gas, it would go much faster than I normally drive, and I get like 8 miles per gallon on the computer, on the instantaneous computer, and I average like 20 miles per gallon over time, but it eats gas up like immediately because it's like, it's a dual override cam engine that just funnels it away. I think we take for granted how advanced vehicles have become in the last 20 years and how they're able to do more with less fuel than ever before.
And hybrids are amazing.
Just the technology and the machinery behind it all. It's all just a next level.
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Radio is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Castle in partnership with KLST 103.5, radiocalicity.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 1 and 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And thanks again for listening.